Hello, welcome to The Verdict, a podcast by the Carlson law firm. And in this series, we go all about car crashes, the injuries that happen because of them, and the surrounding topics. And in this episode, it's not primarily focused on cars, but it's going about boats because, it's summertime, people love driving boats. Boats get transported via vehicles sometimes. So I figured it'd be a nice topic to cover in this series. And in this episode, I'm joined by Craig Carlson and Mike Erskine. Going on about it, Craig, Mike, you've been on a couple of the podcast episodes, but if people don't know you, do you want to get a little introduction, starting with Craig?
Sure. I'm Craig Carlson of the Carlson Law Firm, and I'm the owner operator of this firm, and we've been around since 1971.
Awesome. Mike?
Mike Erskine. I've been working with Craig for 20 years now, and that whole time been representing people for injuries.
Awesome. Thank you both for being on. Like I mentioned, we're covering boats, mainly focused on the recreational boats. We'll get a little bit more out there with like big ships, maritime cases near the end, but I want to focus more on the recreational boats and how that can happen. And I wanted to start off with a simple question to you, Mike, is that how does the process of a case differ with the boat crash and the car crash?
That's an interesting question. To a certain extent, they're kind of the same. And what I mean by that is what you're looking for is there something that someone did, like operating the boat recklessly or driving it too fast, or being intoxicated while operating, the boat. Something that they did that then causes an injury, or is there something that they didn't do? They didn't observe rules and regulations, or they didn't maintain their boat, or there's something that went wrong mechanically and it causes an injury to folks. So, as far as that goes, is you're looking at kind of the same things. The primary difference would probably be when you're talking motor vehicles, there's lots and lots of regulations and state rules and federal rules, depending on what's going on about how you operate a motor vehicle. There's licensing requirements and things like that. When you're talking about boats, especially recreational boats, like on lakes in Texas, there's not a licensing requirement. There's much fewer regulations that are involved in that. So it relies really much more heavily on the behavior of the person who's operating the boat or something about the boat itself.
Okay. And there's boat crashes, and I would figure, Craig, I'll move to you. I would figure, is boat insurance mandatory? Is it by law? Do I have to have boat insurance, sort of like car insurance?
Yeah, interesting. In Texas, there's no requirement for individuals to have boat insurance, although I would say that most do. Boat insurance operates a little bit like car insurance in that it's, you're buying it. So if you injure somebody else, they'll take care of the claims and they'll represent you. But there is no requirement in Texas to have a certain kind of boating insurance on your boat. Again, most people do.
Yeah, that's interesting to me, because you would figure, because boats can be just as dangerous as cars. You figured if they get in an accident, and the thing with boats, there's some of them don't even have like the tops, and you figure some people are not wearing seat belts on boats, and it's near water where people can drown. Learning about that, that's more interesting, because there's not much, I would say, quote unquote, regulation when it comes to on water traffic rather than car to car traffic.
Well, there is, Mike can actually give you some statistics on the boating injuries and wrecks that have been in Texas over the last year. But, there are some requirements and laws, obviously, about drinking and boating. life jackets in boating. For example, if you have children that young children, they always have to have a life vest on. So I guess 13 is under, kids have to have life vest on. And there's boating. The one thing that they're stopping people right now on boats for is, you're supposed to have an automatic shut off on your wrist. So the driver should be having, if they ever detached from their boat, the boat would shut off in some way. And that's something this year they've been focused on. But there are game wardens out on the lakes, and they do make random stops and stops at times. And when there's a death, as there has been on our lake here, Belton, and there's been some down in Lake Travis, were involving alcohol, you'll see an increased presence of game wardens out on the lakes and people out on the lakes watching them. But there, like you say, there aren't seat belts on the boats. And so they, when they strike ground or other people, there can be very serious injuries from that. And in fact, I was just working on a case today with another lawyer in our firm on a boating wreck, and it was an intoxicated person ran into a boat where there was a lot of injuries on the boat, and more injuries than they have insurance. So they happen quite regularly. My first boat case I ever handled involved a jet skier who was run over by a boat, and the blade cut through his shoulder. So there's those. And just a couple of years ago, we resolved a case where a boat got out from its moor. They put it in a dock, but they didn't tie it down. And so it slowly slipped out, and it slipped out onto the lake. And then some people who were fishing, who were driving back to the docks, didn't see this darkened boat in the middle of the lake and ran into it and were very injured. So there's all kinds of boat injuries and fatalities actually when they strike. When boats strike each other or strike land or some other object, there are serious injuries involved. I think Mike can tell you some of the statistics on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the, think about one of the great things about living in Texas, especially Central Texas, is we have just tons and tons of these recreational lakes around. These beautiful, usually well-maintained lakes. But we also have a growing population of people who want to go out and be on those lakes. And probably, what you combine those two things, and what you find out is, last year in 2020, even with COVID and a lot of the state being shut down and people being at home, is Texas hit a 30-year high of boat-related injuries. So on a year that the state was shut down and people were kind of at home for a lot of the year, is 30, think about that, 30 years, the highest level of injuries that have happened in the state of Texas. That's, you look at that and you can break that down even further, and there's a 45% increase between 2019 and 2020 in fatalities alone. So, it's almost half again as big. I think some of it's 67% increase in accidents from 2019 to 2020, and 64% an increase between the just injuries in general. And there's a lot of people out on these lakes. There's a lot of people out of these lakes. And I think you mentioned earlier, when the weather's warm, so May to August, that's when the bulk of these are happening. That's when the bulk of the things are happening. And it's dangerous. The lakes are getting crowded, and there's lots and lots of people. And one of the things that's makes it even more dangerous, there's not really a licensing requirement to operate a motorboat. You have to at least get a driver's license for a car, right?
Yeah.
But for a motorboat, not so much. So you got a lot of inexperienced people out there on the water driving around in motorized vehicles. It's crazy.
Yeah, because you had mentioned, the 67% increase in crashes and the highs of like the 30-year high and things of that nature. With the boating insurance, it's not required by law, but with boating insurance, I'm guessing I'm not a boater, so would it be similar to car insurance? Like I'm guessing different plans, quote unquote, or is it something completely different?
No, there's all kinds of different plans and different ways of buying it, and same companies sell it. So it's a product line they sell. Um, and as we're talking about boats, I was thinking we didn't really talk about jet skis, but they're out on these lakes as well, and you can rent those, so you don't even own them, and you just go out, and if you're over 13, you can drive a boat if you have like a safety course. But like Mike says, people with driver's license, they just walk in and rent a jet ski. Maybe they've never even operated one. They have to wear a life vest to be on a jet ski, but or any personal craft outside of a boat, like you're tugging somebody on a raft or something like that. But yeah, there's just a lot of boats on the water. You can't even buy a boat right now. It's really hard because during COVID, the one activity you might have been able to do is actually go outside and be away from people in lakes and parks. And so there was a tremendous amount of people out in boats, and lots of people on the water in boats is a dangerous situation, particularly with the alcohol involved.
Yeah, and the one thing that you said that caught my attention was that there might be some companies or some activities where people might be able to rent jet skis or various boating vehicles. I was wondering, when a crash like that does happen, does the onus fall back on the person driving the boat because they might have signed a waiver, did like a quick training session, or does that fall on the renting company distributing the boating vehicles?
Well, I think if you're renting a boat from somebody or a jet ski, you're not going to have boating insurance at that point, most likely, unless you own a boat. So you're going to be falling back on their insurance. But if you're the one who was injured riding on a jet ski without proper supervision, they probably always have you sign a waiver. Whether or not the waiver is effective or not is a whole nother matter. So kind of like people sign waivers for driving go-karts or whatever. I mean, half the time those waivers are not legitimate waivers. So they probably will have you sign a waiver. Whether or not it's going to be effective or not is a whole different thing.
And there's things you can do outside of just the kind of the most straightforward thing we think about is someone's on the lake, they're operating the boat, they're going too fast, they're being reckless, or they're drunk or something like that, and then they hit someone, they hit another boat, they hit a jet skier, and they cause an injury. That's kind of what people classically think about. But there's different things you can look at. Is a lot of these, especially these bigger recreational lakes, is these boats, even people's private boats, they're stored in little marinas, right? And a lot of these folks have deals with the marina where they pay someone to maintain the boat, make sure it's mechanically working correctly. So, another thing that you can always look at is if there is a mechanical failure on the boat, whether it's a boat or a jet ski, if there's a mechanical failure associated with it due to poor maintenance, it may not be even an issue with an operator. It may be something where you're wanting to look at, who is responsible for maintaining this? Did they do that correctly? You can look at all sorts of things. If the boat got going and you couldn't decelerate it because that part of the motor was broken or it wasn't working correctly, maybe you have a maintenance case. In which case that might actually be better than the person who's driving the boat, honestly.
Yeah, and there's products cases involved too, with the boat itself or a jet ski, but also with the tow lines. People listening to this might be listening to it because they were injured through a tow line, like being pulled on a ski or on a raft, and the tow line got messed up or didn't work properly and hurt them. And so there are product angles to these boating cases that, again, just like car wrecks, you don't want to hire a lawyer who's never tried one or ever been involved in really taking them to court. You don't want to hire people who have never been involved with litigation with boating wrecks, who have never done that before. So that's why our firm is the firm, our firm and others who have experience with personal injury cases like boating wrecks. You want to look to those firms when you're injured. And there's no downside with our firm and others to get, most personal injury lawyers will look at your case for free. And so you don't have to pay somebody to look at your case. You just have to contact our firm or some other personal injury firm who's experienced in doing this, and they should be able to look at your case for free and give you some good advice about where to go from there, whether you have a case or don't.
For certain free consultations, yeah, that's big.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to mention, Craig, was that when it comes to boating cases, people either think boating cases straight on the water, someone driving a boat, like Mike had mentioned earlier, or you with the jet skis crashing into boats crashing into jet skis, various natures. But the other thing I want to mention is people might think it's uncommon is is there a difference in whether the case or insurance, I'm driving and I'm transporting my boat on the road to a location and there's an accident. Is there any difference there where the boat gets transported and there's a collision?
I think the boat, when it's in transport, would be covered by the auto insurance policy. And so you'd be looking at their auto insurance policy at that point. And Mike's had some cases involving trailers where the trailers have insurance, right, Mike?
I was going to say is I've had the case where the person didn't, I've had a couple cases where the person didn't secure the, you put the boat on the trailer and then you attach the trailer to whatever vehicle. And I've had a couple cases where they haven't attached it correctly to the vehicle. I even had one case where the trailer was attached correctly to the vehicle and that was fine, but they didn't secure the boat to the trailer the right way. And the boat just fell out while on the highway. And that all ends up going under automobile insurance. That's where the coverage ends up on that. Occasionally, what you'll also find is especially if the boat's being transferred, there are rare circumstances where homeowners insurance might kick in depending on what coverage they have under the homeowner insurance. But it's almost always motor under that in that fact pattern.
That's interesting. I wanted to quickly follow up because I know to me it might seem rare, but there's people when driving a truck, there'll be, there might be kids or teenagers that are in the bed of the truck while the truck is driving. What about if someone is sitting in a boat while it's being transported? Is that like a similar predicament right there, or is that something completely different?
Well, I've had that case too.
Oh,
it's enormously dangerous because boats typically don't have seat belts or anything like that. So every bump and bounce on the road will have the potential to throw someone out of the boat while it's being hauled down the road in the trailer. But same thing is if it's on the roadway, if it, once it's out of the water, it's probably falling under automobile insurance.
Well, and it's illegal to have people riding in boats or trailers or even backup pickups, even though that happens a lot in Texas.
Yeah.
But obviously that's illegal. So, and it's very unsafe. So I wouldn't recommend it.
That's not the way. That's not the way to get people from point A to point B with the boat.
Craig, I wanted to bring it back to you because you had mentioned, some of these boat crashes can happen while people are drunk or impaired. Are those cases similar where a boat crashes and the driver is impaired? Is it similar to sort of like a drunk driving case with cars?
Yeah, it has the same 0.08 intoxication level. So it has the same impairment level, and yes, it's boating while intoxicated or while impaired. And those cases are prosecuted the same, and it affects the personal injury case. If somebody ran into you and they were intoxicated, it's a much better case for you if you're injured, just like it is in a car, than it is if they weren't. So the thing with boats, different than cars, is you don't have those lanes on the road and the lines on the road. And that's a whole different little subject, but at one time, none of the roads had lines, and people thought that was safe to operate until they started running into each other all the time. So there are no lines out in the water, and so you know, you really do have to pay attention out there. And you know, unfortunately, drinking while you're on the water is a pretty normal event for people out there, and so hopefully the person operating the boat is not drinking. So it's definitely not safe.
What a lot of people, well, you know, people who boat regularly understand this, but you know, even people who boat semi-regularly, is boats don't have brakes. Boats don't have brakes, and they turn very, very, very differently than a car turns. So even a lot of times, these, you know, people who own boats and, you know, kind of, you know, occasionally go out, take them on the lake, is when kind of your muscle memory and what you're used to is driving a car, because that boat, same thing, you got the wheel there, and you have, you know, you have how you can accelerate and decelerate, but you know, this muscle memory really gets to you. And if your thought process is, I'm driving a car, I can hit brakes, or I can turn a certain way, it's disastrous in a boat. It takes much longer to stop a boat from a high speed to slow it down. And the turns can be much sharper than is physically possible with a car. And when people are unsecured, that's when they go flying out of the boat. Or you can flip a boat. You can flip a boat a lot easier than you probably think it is. So yeah, I mean, that's some other things to keep in mind, is a lot of the problems come from inexperience and high speeds that people are, I mean, it's fun. Get out on the lake, get it going real fast, the wind in your face, it's fun. But it's also very, very dangerous, and it's made even more dangerous because there's a lot of inexperienced people out on the water.
You don't drive your boat near as much as you drive your car. So unless you're, you know, a fisherman who fishes a lot and you're out in your boat a lot, you probably, most people out there are pretty inexperienced, and particularly if they travel to other lakes, they may not be aware of, you know, where you run into trees underwater or some obstacle underwater, which can cause the occupants of their own boat to be very injured. So you might have a claim against somebody you're riding with, should that happen. Or you might have a claim against another boater who runs into your boat.
Now, okay, so in a previous episode, me and another attorney, we covered all about, you know, road conditions and road weather with cars. Now there might be possible cases with that. Craig, I wanted to go back to you. Is there something similar to boats? You know, if there's, is there an option for a case if there's bad weather conditions and there's a boating accident? Is there a case there?
Potentially. I mean, it would have to be pretty extreme situations that people wouldn't have been aware of, and that they kind of came in. One place that operates a lot more than just like being on lakes is you might find that out in the ocean, you know, where you're on an ocean craft and you run into some bad weather and waves. Obviously on our bigger lakes, they have waves and weather matters, but I haven't heard of too many wrecks involving weather themselves on boating, although Mike might have some statistics that show that to be untrue. But most of the boating accidents I'm aware of are where people are run into, or a boat is unattached, kind of floating out there, particularly in the dark. And many of them involve alcohol, you know, these crashes. So it's something to be, you know, and if there's a fair amount of, you know, jet skiing, or should I say skiers and watercraft that are being pulled where people get hurt as well. And it's easy to do when you're on a watercraft being pulled by boat, particularly by an inexperienced boater.
I'd say that inexperienced, high speed, and alcohol, or some combination of those, are by far and away the main causes of recreational boat injuries. Is one or some combination of those three. I guess there are some things, we've been in kind of this, the last few years of record drought. Oftentimes some of the lakes will issue low water warnings, and that's kind of, as far as you're talking, even if you aren't speeding, there could be, warnings out there. It's like, hey, the water's low, watch for submerged trees, trees, islands, shoals, things like that. One thing to remember is most lakes in Texas, especially most lakes in Central Texas, they aren't natural lakes. They're artificially man-made lakes that, have been dammed up as water control by the Army Corps of Engineers, and it's kind of partially run by the Army Corps of Engineers, but mostly run by Texas State Parks and Wildlife Department. So just under the surface of these waters are usually these, they build these dams and they create these lakes where there's big steep valleys. So when the water gets low, is all of a sudden there's trees that could have been there for decades, but there's these dead trees that are just under the surface of the water, or there's little hills in the middle of the lake that instead of being 30 feet under the water are now only 2 feet under the water. So low water can be an issue, especially in the last few years.
Okay, and I wanted to get both of your guys' opinion with first-time boaters, because I know both of y'all mentioned, high speeds, drinking while being on the boat. What are some other common mistakes for inexperienced or first-time boaters that they might make that can lead to collisions?
Well, I think in just putting the boat in the water and actually pulling people, it can be very dangerous. People come back around to pick up people, skiers, or people who fell off a watercraft that they're pulling. And if you've never done it before, it can be very unsafe. I mean, you got to shut off your engine when you get close to people. I mean, it sounds like something that people would know, but how many people lose fingers and hands to lawnmowers every year who don't shut off their lawnmowers when they're emptying their bags? It's kind of a similar thing. And it's just people don't think about the safety involved with it all. And there certainly can be some marine liability if they're giving you a craft without really showing you how to use it safely. So going back to your point you were making earlier. So yeah, I just think it's, you can knock somebody out of a boat very simply by turning the boat at a high speed. Mm-hmm. And so, whereas in a car, you're not going to fall out of the car because there's, sides and a top. Whereas
you're sitting down usually in the car,
and you're belted if you're falling along.
Yeah.
So, but boating, you can easily throw people from the boat pretty quickly, and the liability extends to when you're pulling them too. If you're pulling them in such a way that's dangerous, and somebody gets hurt, they might find a claim against you for negligent operation of the boat.
Well, and the other thing is the lakes aren't exclusively boats. A lot of these lakes, there are people who dive. If that's an inexperienced boater, if you don't know, if you're not looking for it, they have these little buoys that have dive flags on it. There are these red flags that have a white stripe, and it's kind of like it's a known warning is, hey, there's divers in the area. But people who don't know that could just go, oh, there's something floating, and they're taking their boat right over divers. A lot of people see these pontoon party barges. I mean, people have seen those out. There's a lot of people who just jump off and swim in the lake from those. And you can easily, again, if you're going too fast, or even if you're not going that fast, you whack someone in the head with the side of your boat who's swimming. just, the head injury alone could be bad, but they could drown easy if they're knocked unconscious. I mean, there's a lot of dangers out on the lake. And again, the inexperience can be a killer.
And that's particularly true with the trees and under, a lot of, like Mike was saying, a lot of the dams. Now this year we've had more rain than we know what to do with, so the lakes are kind of full. But what that does is make people get closer to the edges and thinking it's safe. And particularly when the lakes are low, there are trees everywhere in these dammed up lakes, and people jumping off boats. You want to be very sure you're in a deep area with no trees to be jumping off a boat. It can be as dangerous as anything else, because I mean, you can end up paralyzed. So it's, again, you got to know your area and know where you're boating, and before you go out there. And you shouldn't be letting people jump off a pontoon boat or any boat if you don't know how deep it is and that it's clear to actually jump in. And on my boat, to be honest with you, when I let my kids or their friends jump in, we do a quick sweep around with our goggles and look around in the water, even though I know it's deep, because my depth finder is telling me it's a deep part of the water. But we just do a quick sweep around the boat looking to make sure it's okay to jump. But I might be overly cautious on that, but I've seen a lot of people who've been injured. And so that's why I make sure that it's safe before I let anybody jump in the water.
Yeah, it's good to take caution and taking them precautions before doing anything with the boats.
Yeah, because it's a lot of fun to be out on the water. And it's a lot of fun. I'm a boater. It's a lot of fun to be out there. But you just want to do it safely, and you want to make sure that everybody comes back and that they had a great time, but they, weren't injured and they weren't seriously hurt.
Yeah. And moving on, so there's instances where people with recreational boats, they might go out too far in the water. And I wanted to ask you, Craig, so when does a boating case turn into a maritime case?
Well, maritime cases, generally you're talking about different bodies of water. So boating cases, I mean, you can have a boat on the ocean and then it's a maritime case. Maritime is used interchangeably with various bodies of water. There's a case called a Jones Act maritime case, which is merchant marine type cases, whereas you work on the water. So if you work on a ship, or you're 30%, or you're a longshoreman, but 30% of your time spent on ships in the water, you're a maritime person at that point. And really, any injury, if the ship has, you get hurt in any way. We just did a case where somebody had a finger pulled off by a rope while they were working on a ship. But we've done ships that have sank. They weren't seaworthy. We did a ship. We did a boat that sank last year on a riverboat, where the boat just sank and the captain died. So those are called Jones Act cases. They come under different law. They come under federal law, which is actually more favorable for injured people. And you basically have to show that people worked on a boat, that they were injured or killed on the boat during their employment, and that the negligent employer was partially at fault for causing the injury. And so it's kind of a low bar. And if you work or have a loved one killed on a boat in the ocean or on a river, you definitely want to get a lawyer. Those cases can be brought and are pretty valuable cases for the people that suffered a loss. So, but they're just different cases. But if you're out on a boat, just a regular boat, and you're a passenger, the same kind of tenets of liability apply, just in a different body of water.
Okay. And Mike, I want to ask you, is there, whether it's recreational boating or the offshore maritime, is there anything else you would like to add? Any type of cases, stories, comments?
I I could probably tell you stories all day long if you gave me the chance. But yeah, no, I mean, they're two very different things. And, what Craig was saying, Jones Act and kind of these things that fall under federal law is we have a lawyer that works with us, Morgan Reed, who is, he's nationally renowned for his knowledge and level of skill and experience in Jones Act cases. And I guess you're probably going to be doing a podcast with him on that. So he can fill you in on all that wonderful stuff on Jones Act. But, it's a very niche, it's a very specialized area of law. And our firm certainly has the expertise and the right personnel to handle those cases. For those other things where we're talking kind of like the recreational boating that are kind of like on the lakes and the rivers here in Texas. Most of that stuff's going to be just right. That's going to be Texas state law. You'll find most of that. There is a Texas Water Safety Act, which are some rules and regulations. It's all in the Texas Parks and Wildlife, part of the regulations in Texas. And Craig had referenced there's a Texas Penal Code about operating a boat while intoxicated. That's where you'd look for that stuff. And I've handled those cases for years. Craig's handled those cases for years. Lots of experience in this firm doing those things. And it's enough different from kind of what you think is, if a lawyer can do a car crash, he can do a boat crash, right? Not really. It's enough different. You want someone who's done those cases before. And, Craig, myself, several other lawyers in our firm, we've all had extensive experience in doing that. And they're definitely worth looking into because people can get just terribly, terribly injured. And it's heartbreaking. There's oftentimes fatalities involved in that stuff. And it's just heartbreaking for the families and the loved ones.
Yeah. And Craig, is there anything you would like to add, whether it's recreational or Jones Act?
No, I just tell people that when they're on the water, try to be as safe as you can. If you don't know the lake, ask the people around the lake that have knowledge of it, about it. And know what Mike said. You can't stop your boat very quickly. And when you're driving a boat or owning a boat, you're responsible for your passengers. And so you need to take care. And it'd be great if there was no injuries ever. And that would be the best thing for everyone. But if you do get injured, because when boat wrecks happen, people are really seriously injured and killed. And if that happens, make sure you go to an experienced law firm like ours or someone else like ours who has experience in doing this and get a lawyer to look at your case and advise you and help you. Just like you wouldn't do your own surgery, or you wouldn't do your own orthopedic work, or you wouldn't do your own dentistry. Don't be your own lawyer. That's a bad idea.
For sure. So yeah, that's it for this episode of The Verdict. Be sure to keep coming back. Actually, this one's the last episode in this series. So if you haven't checked out the other episodes, be sure to check out those and be on the lookout. We'll have plenty of more episodes that's not in this contained series. And this one was all about car crashes, injuries that happen because of them, and even in this one, boat crashes. So if you're listening to this on any podcast platform, be sure to rate us 5 stars. If you're watching the video version of this, subscribe to the Carlson Law Firm on YouTube. And if you want to get more in detail, in depth about the topics covered in today's episode, be sure to look at the description. We'll have links to blogs that you can read more in detail about the topics. And we're on social media. Check us out at the Carlson Law Firm, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. And we also have a Facebook page exclusively in Spanish at Carlson Abogados. And lastly, if you're looking for an attorney, our bilingual team is happy to help. We offer free consultations. You can check out carlsonattorneys.com to see a location near you. And you can reach us at 800-359-5690. We take calls 24/7. So until next time, thank you, Craig. Thank you, Mike, for joining me.